We have been talking about marriage for a while now in this family series, and we talked about why not to get a divorce. We talked about the very first principle of submitting to one another out of reverence to Christ. We want to take the next step in that, though. We talked last week about option 3, not just staying in your marriage and being miserable, but staying in your marriage and making it great. I want to talk about that today, but I came across this example of how spouses may treat a cold in the first 7 years of marriage, because the way they treat it may change. All right, so for instance, first year of marriage. Oh, my baby girl, your baby's got a bad sniffle. Let me rub your back. I'll get a cool cloth for your head. I'll take care of my baby girl. Year number 2. Listen, honey, I don't like the sound of that cough. Let me run to the store and get you some meds. I'll get you whatever you need. I got the house. Take care of everything. Year number 3. Maybe you better lie down, honey. Nothing like a little rest when you're feeling bad. I'll get you something to eat. We got any soup in the cabinet? Year number 4. Now look, dear, be sensible. After you've fed the kids, walked the dog, washed the dishes, you really need to get off your back. Year number 5. Hey, just take a couple aspirin. Year number 6. Why don't you gargle or something instead of sitting there barking like a seal? I can't even hear the game. Year number 7. For heaven's sakes, stop sneezing. You trying to give me pneumonia or something? Now, one of the reasons that's funny is because we see some of that. It may not be that harsh, but you see as the years go on, the little lovey-doveys, the little warm fuzzies, they tend to fade. Things get a little more common. Things get a little more predictable. Things get a little more irritating. We begin to lose that sense. Helen Rowland once said, marriage is like twirling a baton or turning handsprings or eating with chopsticks. It looks easy till you actually try it. But it can be done, and it can be done for God's glory. Now I want you to look. We've been in Ephesians 5, but it's just such a rich passage. And I want to show you today in Ephesians 5, starting with verse 22. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound. And I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband.
This is an ordinary testimony, but that's kind of the point. The reason I'm sharing this is because while there are many who find themselves at the brink of divorce, the brink of brokenness, the brink of having their families ripped apart, there are still many who have purposed to honor their covenant. So they're not leaving or abandoning their marriage. They're committed. They love their spouse. They're not miserable. They're not leaving. They're just ordinary. They just forgot how to see the extraordinary in the ordinary of their marriage. There are many who, when you talk to them about their marriage, they're not giving up. They're still fully committed. They're all in, but you can just sense such desperation in their voice when they talk about their spouse or their marriage. So here's a story about ordinary. Here's a testimony that doesn't end with a question mark, an explanation mark, or even a period, but a ... Because like many marriages, many testimonies about marriage, it's still being written.
Last week when we talked about option 3, we mentioned that the grass is not greener on the other side. It may look greener, but typically, if it looks greener, it's because they're taking better care of their yard. And chances are, if you went over to that greener grass, that grass would start to die. All right? Because if you're not taking care of the grass where you are, you're not going to take care of it over there either. So we're talking about fertilizer today. How you get your grass green? On your grass, your field, your yard. This is easy seed. Easy seed. Patch and repair. Grows anywhere. Guaranteed. It even grows in dense shade. So even if you're married to dense shade, the grass can grow green in your yard, but you have got to care for it. You've got to fertilize it. This says grows anywhere, guaranteed. And here's what I want to tell you today. If you do it God's way, the green grass will grow in your marriage, guaranteed. You say, Bill, you can't guarantee it. If you do it God's way, the grass will grow green in your marriage. All right, so what is God's way? Well, last week we talked about verse 21 of chapter 5, submitting to one another out of reverence to Christ. It begins with two individuals submitting before the Lord. Two individuals submitting to the Lord, submitting to one another out of reverence to the Lord. When we surrender our lives to Christ, which basically means I'm coming off the throne, I'm coming out of control, I am giving you everything. God, what you want for me is what I want for me. I'll do whatever you say. That's where it begins. What happens after that? Well, Paul goes on to tell us in chapter 5. And the first place he goes is he says, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. As to the Lord. The husband, he says in verse 23, the husband is the head of the wife. Now, man, I know. If you had a gun right now, you'd know. Listen, you don't like it. You don't like that kind of talk. I mean, we in 2018, baby. There ain't no head. Here's the thing. He says, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. The relationship here is very important to understand what Paul is talking about. Men and women are equal before the Lord. There's equal footing at the cross. Galatians 3:28. There's no male nor female, no Jew nor Greek, no slave nor free. There's equal footing at the cross. But even with that equality in essence as human beings, God designs it in a way that there's still submission roles. And listen, before women go, man, I don't like it. You know what? Paul compares it to something in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3. The Bible says, but I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of the wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Now look at that last phrase there. Here's what I want you to understand. God the Father and God the Son are equal. But the Son, in their equality, the Son, Jesus, willingly submits to the Father. And that's what he's calling for here. He's calling for a willing submission out of reverence to Christ. When you look at the church, you know, for a wife to say, I will not submit to my husband, is the same thing as a church saying, we will not submit to Jesus. Can you imagine a church doing that? A church being the bride of Christ, saying, Jesus, he's a live church, and we don't care what you got to say. We're going to do it our way. You like, watch out now. There could be some lightning falling. You don't talk to the Lord like that. This same Lord is calling wives in their equality to willingly submit to the husband. Listen, you don't submit to him because he's earned it. You don't submit to him because he deserves it. You certainly don't submit to him because he's smarter or stronger, or he's certainly not better looking than you. I mean, you don't submit for those reasons. You submit out of obedience to Christ. If we want to fertilize the grass in our marriage, if we want it to be greener, the first thing Paul says after us mutually submitting to one another is, wives, submit to your husbands. He also adds in a word there, respect. Respect, right there at the end of the passage. He says, verse 33, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects and honors her husband. It really saddens me sometimes when I see women, wives, putting down their husbands, especially in public, especially on social media. Listen, you understand that you're in direct disobedience to the Lord when you do that. But he did this and he did that. Listen, he is imperfect, and in some ways he may be completely fouled up. But the Bible, basically, here's what God's saying. When you do it my way, I will honor you. I will bless you. You can't control what everybody else does in your life, but you can control you. Wives, he says, if you want to put fertilizer on your grass, if you want your grass to be greener, then respect and submit to your husband. Paul doesn't want there to be any confusion. This is directly linked as a visual to Christ and the church. And the church submits to Christ. Now, if you're a husband, I want you to stand. All husbands stand right now. All right. Now, guys, I want you to hear me carefully. Paul wrote this to wives. Are any of you guys a wife? You better say it like this. I mean, I know in our society today it can get a little crazy. But you're a husband, not a wife. That means this wasn't for you. This never in the Bible, never does the Bible say, husbands, make your wives submit. She is your co-equal before Christ. It is her responsibility to willingly submit to you, but not to be forced into it. And by the way, guys, while I got you up, if you do it God's way, she'll submit to it, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. Have a seat. The second way that we put fertilizer on that grass is, he says, husbands, love your wives. But it's not just a simple love your wives. Like he told the women, the wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. He told the husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. So quick question, just so we understand here. What did Christ do for the church? Did Christ do anything for the church? He died. He took on not just death. He took on the cross. He took on the most humiliating death you could be subjected to. He was stripped naked and nailed to a cross. Why? So that he could have a relationship with us. Guys, to love your wife as Christ loves the church means that you self-sacrifice, you give of yourself, you put her interest above your own. It is the type of love that is giving, 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 regardless of what you get in return. I mean, think about your own relationship with Jesus Christ and all that he has given, all that he has done for you, and the times where we have not stepped up, where we have not lived up to our part of the bargain, where we have not been faithful. And he continues to give and give and give. Love your wife as Christ loved the church. Guys, you might say, well, my wife won't submit to me. Listen, bro. You treat her like Christ treated the church. You sacrifice your life on her behalf. You get her to the point where she trusts everything you do because she knows whatever you do is going to be in her best interest. She'll submit to that. She'll submit to it. The reason wives don't often or have trouble submitting is because too many men are living with their own self-interest at the top. They're not loving as Christ loved the church. And you know what the paradox here is? I love this where he says this in he says in verse 28, in the same way husbands shall love your wives as your own body. He who loves his wife loves himself. The paradox is when you live sacrificially, when you love sacrificially, when you love sacrificing yourself for her, you're actually loving yourself. Because she's going to respond to that. It becomes a very beautiful thing. He mentions in verse 29, nurturing and cherishing. This is how we love, nurture and cherish her. Just think about those words. Holding close, protecting, taking care of. You know, in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, the Bible says this. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way. I can stop right there. That's a whole message as well. Showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel. All right now. All right. Women, he ain't talking to you right there, all right? In fact, let's just do this. All wives, stand up. Your wife, stand up. When he starts, husbands, he's not talking to you. He never in the Bible says, wives, hold your husband accountable to love you as Christ loved the church. Because you could take that verse, boy, and you could nag the mess out of him. Everything he does, everything he said. Excuse me, is that what Christ would do to the church? That's what Bill said on Sunday. I don't think you're doing it right. Listen, he's not talking to you. Now, women read this verse and they go, no, I ain't the weaker vessel. I'm not the weaker vessel. Okay, two things. One, he's not talking to you. And two, he's telling them to treat you as the weaker vessel. How do you treat a weaker vessel? How do you treat? You nurture. You hold dear. You care for them. You cradle them. You protect them. Because you don't want anything to happen to them. You want your husband doing these things. You want him to treat you in a way that you're a treasure that he doesn't want anything to happen to. Have a seat. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. These are the two ingredients in the fertilizer for making your grass green.
You've heard of the ultimate warrior, the ultimate ninja, the ultimate fighter. Well, I was the ultimate dater. I loved the process of dating, everything about it. I loved the whole adrenaline of getting up the nerves to ask a girl out. And then you ask and you're waiting for her response while you're fully sure you've convinced her there is no way she can say no to you. And then you ask, and then the wait and the yes. Ace in the hole. And then remember the time when you were dating, when you knew you were going out on a date every time, and the effort and the energy that would go in to just getting ready to go out for dinner or to a movie. I mean, especially if you're a girl, you were a girl, you spend the whole day getting ready. Take a shower, put on your best smelling stuff, you brush your hair, makeup is perfect. If you're guys, every clothing arrangement is in detail, and the car is clean, and you drive over. And then you get ready early, and you just sit and you wait for your date to arrive. Remember that feeling, just the waiting, looking out the window, the anticipation, your heart beating, butterflies in your stomach. Pull up in the driveway, walk up the stairs, knock on the door, the wait, the anticipation, heart about to burst through your chest, door opens, hello, embrace, moment, anticipation, excitement. In the process of dating, there was no expense that I would not spare. No amount of money that I was not prepared to spend. My only rule was that it had to be original, creative, something no one else had ever done. Not something I borrowed from a line or movie or anything else. It had to be my creation. So whether it's flowers, songs that would be sung, dances to be danced, whatever it took to impress that girl in that moment. And then after all that effort, smile or a blush, moment in time. But who does that anymore once you're married and after you say, I do? I mean, remember the moments when you were dating, and just to hear him or her breathe was enough. Just to sit beside them on a bench, or that first moment when your hand touched hers, and that would produce this boop, 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 boop in your heart. Your heart would beat through your chest, butterflies in your stomach. So I met a girl named Lori, and we began that whole dating process. The difference was, for this girl, unlike any of the others, this was 7 years worth of that. You know, we experienced all those things, but because of my position at that stage of life in church, our whole dating relationship was lived out in front of hundreds of people, which for me, I think was okay. I'm not so sure that was anything she ever asked for. I always struggled, not so much with the definition of love or my definition of love, but more with my application of love, particularly in that relationship. Because our lives were lived out in front of everybody, there's this expectation that you have to be a certain way or live a certain way or be above reproach, you know, live your lives with a certain amount of integrity. So because of that, there's some sort of, extravagance or passion that you distance yourself from, whereas you not normally in just a regular relationship. And so that whole spare no expense, love the dating, man, pursuit, what it brought out of me thing began to tire and fade. As I look back, and it takes looking back to realize that, because I didn't see it then. I did not realize, especially in the latter years, when she was waiting and hoping for a ring, how immensely, fiercely she loved me. What I perceived as her just tagging along at events was her just desire to be where I was. There was a moment of our dating relationship where she gave a lot just to be near me. But we got married. I finally popped the question in an original and creative way, which is another story for another day. But fairy tale wedding, over 500-600 people there, a church full of people who loved us and walked in relationship with us. I mean, everything was perfect. And we settled into life as honeymooners, which was great. It was awesome. I mean, young married couple, you're young, you go where you want to go, you do what you want to do, you have dreams, expectations just like everybody else. And then just like everybody else, you begin a family, and kids come along and expenses come along, and you're doing jobs and schedules, and there are more and more expectations and more pressures put on you, and you're growing older and you're realizing and you're becoming aware, and people are depending on you. And so before long you settle into that mundane, everyday 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. routine that families do. And so your schedules are colliding and separating all at the same time, and you're trying to manage it and get here to get there, and then all of a sudden one day you wake up and it's almost like you're once was that fierce, burning, dating, honeymooner love that you have. Now it's almost like your spouse is more like your brother or sister, or you find you are mutual babysitters or cab drivers. Before long, that person who once produced that boo, 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 boo in your heart's gonna beat out of your chest, butterflies in your stomach, getting up early, getting ready early, all those things before long, you begin to just take that person and that love for granted, and you become apathetic. I was not going anywhere. I was totally committed. We both were totally committed. We love each other. None of that's changed, but you're just routine. You're just ordinary. We all come to this place in life where life seems to just become like it's this rat race, and you settle into ordinary. It's this place in your marriage where you would love to go back and feel some of the things you felt when you were dating, just your hand in their hand, butterflies in the stomach, heart, the anticipation, getting ready all day. I mean, what would it look like if spouses came home early and from work and got dressed up and waited just for their other spouse to get home in anticipation of the moment? We just come to this place where it's not that you're going anywhere. It's not that you're not satisfied. Maybe you are, but you're committed to the covenant. You're not going anywhere. You're just blah.
My guess is if you have been married for a while, you could easily nod your head at what he's saying. It's so easy to just get into the routine and responsibilities, to lose the passion, to lose the fervor. I know it. I'm there too. It takes work. You've actually got to fertilize that marriage. But the beauty is when we do it God's way, the results come. Guaranteed. When wives submit to their husbands as to the Lord, and husbands love their wives as Christ loved the church, the truth is you get this mutually satisfying relationship that is growing and growing. Just like our relationship with the Lord should be growing. More and more intimacy. It can work. It doesn't matter where your marriage is right now. It doesn't matter how far you come, how numb you are, how stale it's gotten. Get out the fertilizer and start working the field. It's not too late. It takes work, but it's worth it. At the end of the service today, when you leave, we've got just this little sheet on here, and there's 30 ways to say I love you. There's a whole lot more than that. But here's your 30 to start. Little things many of these you did that first year of marriage. But you just stopped somewhere along the way. How about bringing some revitalization to the grass in your field? Fertilize that thing.
So, the moment for me came My wife and I were having an argument, and it's another story for another day, but the argument ended with her sitting on the end of the bed saying to me, "I feel so alone. I just feel so alone." I'm like, alone? I'm right here. We've been married for almost 18 years. What do you But I knew what she meant, because I felt the same way. And I had contributed to that. The truth is, we were both at fault. It takes two in every marriage, and we were both at fault. It was only days after that I was sitting at my desk. There's a picture on my desk of us from our wedding day. And I was looking at this picture, thinking about that day, and saying to myself, gosh, she was so beautiful. And the truth is, she still is. But I just forgot. I just forgot. Because I took her for granted. And I was ordinary. So often, we waste so much energy on what's wrong with our spouse rather than focusing on what's right. And we just forget. Ephesians 5 says that the most visible illustration of the way Christ loves the church is a marriage. The love between a husband and wife. So when we were preaching that, and I was thinking about that, I thought about my love for Christ as it pertains to worship. I've always, no one could argue that I've always been, at least I think, a passionate and competitive worshiper. And whether I felt it or I was making the choice to do it, I've always felt like God's glory was worth my effort to bring everything I have. I tried to live that out on stage. If I'm equating to the way I love my wife and the visible illustration of how that looks compared to the way I love Jesus, especially when I'm worshiping, I had to come face to face and deal with the fact that sometimes, not all times, but sometimes the way I love my wife in our marriage is not with the same passionate, demonstrative love with which I worship. Ephesians 5:21. Submit yourselves to one another out of reverence for Christ. The motivation whether you feel it or whether it's a choice to love your spouse, is always out of reverence for Christ. That is the essence of covenant. And there will be times when you feel like doing that and times when you don't, but out of reverence for Christ means that you recognize that even when you love, and it may not be reciprocated, or you may be in that valley, it's still doing something. And it's still worth it. Covenant is always worth it. The fight is always worth it. There is always way more at stake than your personal gratification. And what's true about finding the extraordinary in the ordinary is when you start with that out of reverence for Christ. He begins to invade the ordinary with extraordinary. Butterfly in the stomach. Knock on the door. Wait. Hello. Embrace. Hand in hand. Again. And that's worth it. Love for Christ and the love for your spouse is always worth it. And that's when the ordinary becomes extraordinary.